Yes. Sheila. Mother, she's just died a horrible death, don't forget. Mrs. Belling. I'm very sorry, but I think she had only herself to blame. Inspector. Was it owing to your influence, as the most prominent member of the committee, that help was refused the girl? Mrs. Burling. Possibly. Inspector. Was it or was it not your influence? Mrs. Bowling. Stung. Yes, it was. I didn't like her manner. She impertinently made use of our name, though she pretended afterwards it just happened to be the first she thought of. She had to admit, after I began questioning her, that she had no claim to the name, that she wasn't married, and that the story she told at first about a husband who deserted her was quite false. It didn't take me long to get the truth, or some of the truth, out of her. Inspector. Why did she want help? Mrs. Burling. You know very well why she wanted help. No, I don't. I know why she needed help. But as I wasn't there, I don't know what she asked from your committee. Mrs. Burling. I don't think we need to discuss it. Inspector. You have no hope of not discussing it, Mrs. Burling. Mrs. Burling. If you think you can bring any pressure to bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. Unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of, or that won't bear investigation. The girl asked for assistance. We are asked to look carefully into the claims made upon us. I wasn't satisfied with this girl's claim. She seemed to me to be not a good case, and so I used my influence to have it refused. And in spite of what's happened to the girl since, I consider it my duty. So if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind. Inspector. Yes, I have. Mrs. Burling. No, you haven't. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. Inspector. Very deliberately. I think you did something terribly wrong, and that you are going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen Sheila bursting in. No, please, not that again. I've imagined it enough already. Inspector. Very deliberately. Then the next time you imagine it, just remember that this girl was going to have a child. Sheila, horrified. No! Oh, horrible, horrible! How could she have wanted to kill herself? Inspector. Because she'd been turned out and turned down too many times. This was the end. Sheila. Mother, you must have known. Inspector. It was because she was going to have a child that she went for assistance to your mother's committee. Burling. Look here, this wasn't Gerald Kraft. Inspector, cutting in sharply. No, nothing to do with him. Sheila. Thank goodness for that. Though I don't know why I should care now. Inspector to Mrs. Burling. And you've nothing further to tell me, eh? Mrs. Burling. I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility. Inspector. That doesn't make it any less yours. She came to you for help at a time when no woman could have needed it more. And you not only refused it yourself, but saw to it that the others refused it too. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. You've had children. You must have known what she was feeling. And you slammed the door in her face. Sheila, with feeling. Mother, I think it was very cruel and vile. Burling, dubiously. I must say, Sybil, that when this comes out at the inquest, It isn't going to do us much good. The press might easily take it up. Mrs. Burling, agitated now. Oh, stop it, both of you. And please remember, before you start accusing me of anything again, that it wasn't I who had turned her out of her employment, which probably began it all. Turning to Inspector. In the circumstances, I think I was justified. The girl had begun by telling us a pack of lies. Afterwards, when I got the truth, I discovered that she knew who the father was. She was quite certain about that. And so I told her it was her business to make him responsible. If he refused to marry her, and in my opinion, he ought to be compelled to, then he must at least support her. Inspector, and what did she reply to that? Mrs. Burling, oh, a lot of silly nonsense. Inspector, what was it? Mrs. Burling, whatever it was, I know it made me finally lose all patience with her. She was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that was simply absurd in a girl in her position. Inspector, very sternly. Her position now is that she lies with a burnt-out inside on a slab. As Burling tries to protest, turns on him. Don't stammer and yammer at me again, ma'am. I'm losing all patience with you people. What did she say? Mrs. Burling, rather cowed. She said that after that the father was only a youngster, silly and wild and drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He had given her money, but she didn't want to take any more money from him. Inspector, why didn't she want to take any more money from him? Mrs. Burling, all a lot of nonsense. I didn't believe a word of it. Inspector, I am not asking you if you believed it. I want to know what she said. Why didn't she want to take any more money from this boy? Mrs. Burling, oh, she had some fancy reason. As if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Inspector sternly, I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. What reason did she give for not taking any more money? Mrs. Burling, her story was that he'd said something one night when he was drunk that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money. Inspector, where had he got it from then? Mrs. Burling, he'd stolen it. Inspector, so she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take stolen money? Mrs. Burling, that's the story she finally told after I refused to believe her original story, that she was a married woman who had been deserted by her husband. I didn't see any reason to believe that one story should be any truer than the other. Therefore, you're quite wrong to suppose I shall regret what I did. Inspector, but if her story was true, if this boy had been giving her stolen money, then she came to you for help because she wanted to keep this youngster out of any trouble. Isn't that so? Mrs. Burling, possibly, but it sounded ridiculous to me. So I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance. Inspector, you're not even sorry now, when you know what happened to the girl. Mrs. Burling, I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it. Inspector, who is it to blame then? Mrs. Burling, first of all, herself. Sheila bitterly, for letting father and me have her chucked out of her jobs. Mrs. Burling, secondly, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he didn't belong to her class and was some drunken younger idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. he should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him. Inspector: and if her story is true, that he was stealing money? Mrs. Sperling, rather agitated now. There's no point in assuming that. Inspector: but suppose we do. What then? Mrs. Sperling: then he'd be entirely responsible, because the girl wouldn't have come to us and have been refused assistance if it hadn't been for him. Inspector: so he's the chief culprit anyhow? Mrs. Sperling: certainly, and he ought to be dealt with very severely. Sheila, with sudden alarm: Mother, stop! Sperling: be quiet, Sheila. Sheila: but don't you see? Mrs. Sperling, severely: you behave like a hysterical child tonight. Sheila begins crying quietly. Mrs. Sperling turns to Inspector: and if you take some steps to find this young man, and then make sure that he is compelled to confess in public his responsibility, instead of staying here asking unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty. Inspector grimly: don't worry, Mrs. Sperling. I shall do my duty. He looks at his watch. Sorry for that. Mrs. Sperling, triumphantly: I'm glad to hear it. Inspector: no hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility, eh? Mrs. Sperling: certainly. I consider it your duty. And now, no doubt you like to say good night. Inspector: not yet. I'm waiting. Mrs. Sperling: waiting for what? Inspector: to do my duty. Sheila, distressed: no, Mother, don't you see? Mrs. Sperling, understanding now: but surely, it's ridiculous. She stops and exchanges a frightened glance with her husband. Sperling, terrified now: look, Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my boy is mixed up in this? Inspector, sternly: if he is, then we know what to do, don't we? Mrs. Sperling has just told us. Sperling, thunderstruck: my God, but look here. Mrs. Sperling, agitated: I don't believe it. I won't believe it. Sheila: Mother, I begged you to stop. Inspector holds up a hand. We hear the front door. They wait, looking towards the door. Eric enters, looking extremely pale and distressed. He meets their inquiring stares. Curtain falls quickly. End of Act 2.